Okay, well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. We're extremely grateful that Sir Martin Sorrell has come during a lunch hour, which is almost an impossibility. But we nabbed him. But
lunch in the advertising industry is not 1 hour. goes on longer than that.
Well, even more. So we're extremely grateful. Now, the format is very simple. We like to encourage interaction between yourselves and Sir Martin and ask him questions, which I'm sure he will be able to answer more than adequately.
Or not.
And I'm going to be here to make sure that your question is intelligent, because if they're not, they will be shot down immediately, because this is an intelligent forum. And thank you very much for coming. And as you will see, this is a new thing. The idea is to tell you more about China, but not necessarily through China itself. We don't want to ram China down your throat. It's much easier, in my mind, to understand China from a Western point of view, if you live in the West, and see how that impacts business thinking, business ideas, business executions in China. And so we hope that Sir Martin will be able to give us many pearls of wisdoms about how advertising works in China, which is, of course, a huge, huge market. And without further ado, I'm going to let Sir Martin talk for as long as he wants, for 10 or 15 minutes, or 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions, then I'm going to let you, the audience, to take the floor, and we end this sharply at 2. And I hope that you have an enjoyable session, stimulating and excited. And this is not one of those forums where some ambassador or boring presenter is going to read out something and you get bored.
How do you know I wasn't going to read out something?
Well, because I know you're not a boring man. So I've known you for many years.
Okay, here goes boring.
So here it goes.
Okay, thank you, David. Delighted to be at the China Exchange for the Prudential Series. You get the sponsorship right. And congratulations on this initiative, David. So I don't know what I can usefully say about, you said use the word advertising, and of course we don't define it as advertising. We call it advertising and marketing services, or communication services, which is, just so you get an idea of the scale of China in this particular area. So the world is, our industry is about $1 trillion if you define it as advertising communication services. The media part of it, including some of the new stuff, is about 500 billion, so about half of that trillion. And the US would be about 140 billion of that 500 billion, or the trillion, defining it as old media and some of the new media. And China would currently be about $80 billion. So that gives you rough orders of magnitude to think about. In the case of WPP, our billings, that's the equivalent to that 500 billion, is about 75 billion. So if you do the maths on that, you know, we have about a 15 share worldwide, broadly defined, and that includes clients going directly to the media owners, as well as going through agencies. And our share of the agency market is about a 25-30 share. So think about us being about 25% to a third, depending on how you define it, of the world market, with the number one. And our revenues, so the billings, that's the amount of money that flows through the media, is 75 billion. Our revenues are about 20 billion. And just to give you a scale for China, for us, the US is our biggest market, about 6 billion of that 20. The UK is second at around 3 billion, 3.2 billion. Our share in the US is about 25%. Our share in the UK is about 40%. And China is now already our third largest market, at around, this year will be around 1.6 billion of revenue. And in China, we have about a 15 share. And we have 180,000 people worldwide, of whom about 30,000, a little bit less, are in US. About 16,000 here in the UK, and the same number in China. We have 16,000 people in China. Revenue's 1.6 billion, third largest market for us. We started in China. I think it's worth going through this. I started WPP with one other individual in 1985. So we actually celebrated our 30th anniversary technically on May the 9th, on Saturday, which was nice. And WPP, to confuse you, totally stands for Wire and Plastic Products. It was a small listed engineering company, which at that time, from Dartford in Kent, made wire baskets for supermarkets and pots and pans. Still does, but on a smaller scale, obviously. And we were capitalized about £1 million, and today we're capitalized about £20 billion or $32 billion, to be precise. But our flirtation, if that's the right word, with China started really in 1987 when we acquired JWT. J. Walter Thompson Company had already established itself in China, and in '89 we acquired Ogilvy and Mather, which had also are known in Chinese as Oh My, well known in China. And both agencies had established themselves in China well before '87 or '89 when it came into WPP. In 1989, I unusually took the board of WPP, what was then Wire and Plastic Products, would you believe, to Hangzhou to have a board meeting. Very unusual. Some of our competitors to this day have not held board meetings in China, in mainland China, but we went in 1989 and I went by rail from Hong Kong to Guangzhou. We were in a hotel on the Pearl River, and it was interesting, worth going through this. The hotel on that weekend that we met in 1989 was coming to the end of its JV. This was, in those days, known as an exploding JV. The original JVs, joint ventures with Western companies, were exploding ones, i.e., after 14 or 16 years, I think it was, the Chinese JV partner had the right to buy out the foreign investor at book value. And in our business, book value, because our assets are people, they're not things, buildings, etc., the asset value would be very low. And in fact, our original JVs in China, the ones that JWT and Ogilvy established, were those exploding JVs. And the fear of a Western investor or Western company would be that the Chinese partner would take over his or her JV half at book value at the end of that 14 or 16 years. On the weekend that we were in that Pearl River Hotel, the JV Chinese partner took over, interestingly, the half of the hotel JV. I always remember that. And always remember that our ventures were exploding ones, and the Chinese partner never exercised their rights in relation to our JV, even though it would have actually been in their interest to do so, certainly from a short-term financial point of view. Anyway, we had our board meeting in Hangzhou, and I remember traveling up on the train from Hong Kong to the hotel. And in those days, there was one track from Hong Kong. And the journey took about 3 hours, I think it was. It was a Sunday afternoon. I remember it very clearly because I looked out the window of the carriages as we went up to Hangzhou. And because it was just one track, if it was a down train, you had to go into the siding to let the down train go through, or the down train had to do it vice versa. And I always remember looking out of the window and seeing literally, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of Chinese building the second railway line by hand, literally by hand, carrying the railway sleepers on their backs, the iron bars of the rails on their backs. And I thought to myself at that time, it made a big impression upon me, the reason I'm telling you this long, turgid story, made a big impression because I thought to myself, what are we doing in the UK on a Sunday afternoon? Well, we'd probably be in the pub watching Manchester United. I think Manchester United were playing on Sundays at that time. But anyway, we certainly would not be working in the way the Chinese. I remember this, and it made a big, big impact on me for all sorts of reasons. And from that day on, I thought there was no stopping China. And you remember, this is This is about 3 to 4 years after Deng Xiaoping's famous speech, which many attribute sort of the origins of modern Chinese economic development, and the rest is history. And today, we have a business, as I say, of about 1.6 billion in revenue, 16,000 people. We operate in 80 Chinese cities. We have actually, those are full-time employees that I referred to. We actually have well over 100,000 Chinese that work for us in distribution. David in the office was saying how Chinese retail is being revolutionized at the moment because of pricing and consumerism and traveling abroad and the like, particularly in luxury goods. I would disagree a little bit with what he said. We can debate that. But what we do in China is distribution is key, not just for foreign brands, but for local brands. And of course, the local brands have cracked distribution because they know the market much more effectively than the Western brands. But we have about 100,000 people who are distributors, display people inside stores, who display merchandise inside stores for shoppers as they walk through them. So we're heavily involved in distribution. So that's the history of a little bit of what WPP has done in China. We have a 15 share. We are far bigger than anybody else in the market. Our Western competitors fail to give data on what the size of their operations is or are, and the reasons are quite clear, is because we have a scale there which is quite remarkable. We have not had in our industry any significant problems in developing our business in China, and that may be because I'm convinced that in some bureaucrat's drawer, or several bureaucrats' drawers in Beijing, there is a list of industries that the government, the Chinese government, believes should be state-controlled, state-influenced, or should be dominated by state investment. We are not regarded now, as a result of saying what I'm saying here at the China Exchange, that might change, but we are not regarded as being a strategically important industry. Interestingly, media ownership is. So, for example, Rupert Murdoch tried very unsuccessfully to develop his business in China, eventually sold it to one of the peoples on our board. I should say that we have 2 Chinese on our board. Very unusual for a Western company to have Chinese nationals on their boards. We have 2 of them. I think Unilever has 2, but beyond Unilever, I'm not aware of many that have even 1. We have 2, and they're interesting individuals. One is Rugang Li, who is chairman of Shanghai Media Group, which is the 2nd largest media group in China after CCTV, and we have a joint venture with CCTV. We monitor, we measure television audiences in China, and it's a joint venture with CCTV, and Shanghai Media Group is the 2nd largest. Rugang also runs China Media Capital, which is a state-owned private equity company. And I mention it because Rugang bought Rupert Murdoch's remaining interests in China about 2 or 3 years ago, and instantly, and when I say instantly, within 3 to 6 months, turned round those interests and created what was what still is, I think, the most popular reality show on Chinese television within 3 to 6 months. Shows you that. And the other guy that we have on our board, we don't have Chinese women on our board, sadly, but we have 2 very important Chinese men. The other one is a guy called Hugo Shong. Hugo Shong is the leading private investor, private equity venture capital investor in China. And Hugo has actually about 100 commission men and women around China bringing him ideas in terms of private equity and venture capital, and has been the most successful investor with Accel Partners, and now Jim Breyer, IDG, with Jim Breyer, who's also a very well-known Western private equity venture capital investor. But we have these 2 on the board, and as I said, the industry is not regarded, I think, as being a strategically important one, and therefore we've had little, if any, issues to deal with in developing our business throughout China. And I'll finish before we open up by just centering in on one particular area, which I think is terribly important. So I mentioned that the industry is about 80 billion. So 500 billion, US is about 140 billion, about 80 billion is China. And you would think that the Chinese industry was dominated by traditional media, wouldn't you? You would think it was CCTV and Shanghai Media Group, which I mentioned, Hunan Television, which is the third largest free-to-air network, the classic networks like a CBS or ABC or a BBC or ITV or whatever it happens to be. But oh no, that is not the case. There is 30 billion, so a third or so, which is already well developed in internet and mobile. In fact, that figure is probably higher than the average for the world. Not as high as here in the UK, because the UK is the most highly developed internet, would you believe, and e-commerce country in the world, running at even higher than a third, probably around 40%. But in China, it's already 30 billion. Well over 30 billion of that 80 billion, 82 billion, comes from the internet. There is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of Chinese technology. It's fashionable in the West. I mean, basically, the West doesn't want China to succeed. Basically, we're all sort of envious of China, I think, or not all of us, but many of us, particularly in terms of industry. And of course, the simple charge that we make is the Chinese steal. They copy. They don't have original thoughts. Well, we used to say the same thing, if you remember, about the Hong Kong Chinese. We used to say the same thing about the Japanese. And we used to say the same thing about the South Koreans, and look what happened. What's happened really in the last 3 or 4 years, and I visit China, or try to, about 6 times a year, and I make it a point to go there as much as I can on the ground. My visits tend to be concentrated on the coastal plain, on Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, but I have gone into the hinterland, mainly because places like Chengdu and Chongqing, because the government policy, whether you look at the 12th five-year plan, the 11th one, or the 13th one that will come out shortly, those plans stress the importance of the development of the hinterland and the relatively underdeveloped parts of China to the west and into the internal part of the countries. But as I've gone around there, what I've sought to do is also see the local companies. Now we represent all our large Western-based clients, but what I've done is to go to companies like Huawei, Suning, the leading retailer, Haier, COFCO, a lot of the state-owned enterprises, 999, which is part of China Resources, the largest Chinese state-owned company. By the way, SASAC, which is the government holding company, last time I checked, if you added up the sales of all the state-owned enterprises in China which are controlled by SASAC, you get to about $2.3 trillion in sales. So it gives you an idea of scale. But what I tried to do was to go and see these local companies and their chairmen and CEOs on their local, on their ground, on their own ground. Very rare for a Western CEO to do that. And what I found, I did this for the first time, I blocked out 2 weeks on my calendar and I went round with the guy who's our strategy officer, then based in Shanghai. We positioned our chief strategy officer in Shanghai. So worldwide global strategy office in Shanghai. He's now moved to Singapore. But for 7 years he was based in China. And did that really to get a better understanding. The remarkable thing about every chairman and CEO that I saw, whether it was at a technology company, and we saw Jack Ma, we saw Lei Zhong of Xiaomi, which is the leading handset manufacturer, more of that in a second. Everyone that we saw, even in traditional legacy industries or in these so-called new technology industries, had a fundamentally better understanding of technology and the web, I would say, than Western CEOs. And this was two years ago, and I came back, wrote some blogs, did some stuff on LinkedIn on this, and everybody sort of poo-pooed it. But here we are 2 years on, and we are witnessing the birth of some really, or the development of some real technological giants in China. Huawei is a phenomenon. and we're sitting here in a BT building, and of course, somewhat controversially, BT have developed strong trading links with Huawei, whereas, of course, the Americans have not. Xiaomi, I mentioned, is a handset manufacturer. It's worth it. Lei Zhong who's the entrepreneur who started Xiaomi, handset manufacturer, producing Apple-style phones at cheaper prices. Assembled by the same people, actually assembled by Foxconn to their design. But their model is really interesting. They are only internet delivered. You can't buy it through a retail store. They've expanded now into India. They're going into Brazil and Indonesia, which in and of itself is quite interesting in terms of the countries they've gone into. And Xiaomi is delivered over the internet. And every Friday, this is the really fascinating thing, every Friday, 500,000 software engineers get online, a certain time on Friday, and they send to Xiaomi recommendations for software development on the technology. This is Android software. So it's when people say Google has no presence in China, think again. Android is the most powerful software, and it's in China as well. It's the most powerful software in China, and Xiaomi uses Android software. In fact, they hired Hugo Barra, who was the leading software engineer and developer at Google, to come to China to supervise their international development. We met with him a few weeks ago, and he's heavily involved in the Indian expansion of the business now. But 500,000 software engineers get on. It's almost become a game in China, and recommend changes to the software programs, and then Xiaomi makes decisions as to which changes they incorporate into their software development. So I just give you that as some examples, because if China did copy and steal, which is probably true, they are not doing as much of that as they used to, and in fact they're initiating. And I think one of the technological forces in our country will be Chinese technology, and will be the development of brands. There's another one called OnePlus that is, I think, internet delivered again. I don't know. Forecasting this will be more successful than Xiaomi. And prior to the launch of the 6 Plus, the 6 and the 6 Plus by Apple, Xiaomi was the market leader. They will achieve, I think, market leadership again, not only in China, but in other world. So that's a little bit about us in China, about the market, technology, and the development of the market.
Well, that's quite a lot to
Too much.
digest. Too much. I'm sure that every one of you will be tested. I'll start off with two questions. Presumably, from what you have said, China is going to be a very important market in WPP, and it has been a growing one since the first visit you went there, and it's going to be amazing in the years to come. So my first question is, why did your strategic guy move to Singapore?
Well, the reason that he did that, you're sharp as always, David. He had young kid. His wife was French Vietnamese, and she and her kid wanted to move to Singapore. Not so much, I mean, they weren't in Beijing, where the pollution, of course, is a major problem, but they found it more amenable for expats. Now, it's a really interesting story, and there is only one major CEO of and he is CEO, and I won't say who it is, but you can figure out who it is actually probably. There's only one major CEO of the Asia-Pacific region that I am aware of that is located in Beijing. As a result of that guy, and he and his wife have lived there for 3 or 4 years. As a result of that guy being based in Beijing, that particular company in its industry has the preeminent position in its industry. And I think the fact is that more should follow that example. So, Scott Spirit moved from Shanghai, was there for 7 years, to Singapore. I think the fact that we had him there. And of course, I should also explain, we have country managers in many of our countries. We were in 111 countries. In 50 of those countries, we have regional or country managers. Our country manager in China is a Chinese woman called Bessie Lee, who came out of our media operation, that's media planning and buying operation, and TB Song. TB Song is sort of the David Ogilvy of China, still runs Ogilvy in China, highly revered figure in the advertising industry. So we have, and both interestingly are Taiwanese Chinese. You know, when I first went to that board meeting in 1989, our Taiwanese Chinese, TB, and a woman called Shannon, who's still there, she's chairman of Ogilvy in China, mainland China, used to go to Beijing or Shanghai. They used to have to travel down to Hong Kong and up again to get in, but they eventually located themselves and their families in mainland China. And our strongest leadership, actually, when one talks about expats, our strongest leadership in China, people we regard as being mainland Chinese, actually came, ironically, from Taiwan. And the Hong Kong Chinese were not as successful in developing our businesses as the Taiwanese Chinese, mainly coming from Taipei, because the HongOng Chinese were probably a little bit too showy, David.
I don't think so. I think that all I would say to that is that your fellow who's gone to Singapore is going to be bored out of his mind before long and be begging you to send him back
his life in China
to Shanghai. The second question, before I throw open because we've got half an hour, is that your revenue in China is 1.6 billion. You've got 16,000 people, so per head,
yes, they're
bringing in 100,000 US. Is that a high number compared with, let's say, UK?
No, UK. So we do double.
Double
with the same double revenue with the same number of people.
So why is it so inefficient in China?
You're being very cruel. Well, it's in an earlier stage of development.
All right.
And of course, now the margins in China are very strong. You know, this is really interesting. I was chairman of the International Business Council, which is 120 CEOs, Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum Business Council, for 2 years, a few years ago. And I remember my first session was a summer session, and the thing that I tabled in the summer session, which is in August, probably is about 60 of those 120 that come. And the question I asked was, how many of you are profitable in China? And very few are. And by the way, very few are prepared to admit that they aren't, which makes it even more difficult to figure out who the hell is. But I've got to tell you that our margins in China are extremely effective. The people are phenomenal. And I should just add this. Scott, when he was in Shanghai, we have the WPP Advertising School in Shanghai. And let me just tell you what actually happened, because it's really interesting. It tells you a lot about the Chinese. We just signed a MOU last week in India to do the same thing in Mumbai. But basically, we now have, at the moment, about 150 to 200 students going through a 4-year course. It's not a university, it's a technical college. It's called SADA, Shanghai Advertising and Design Academy. And this is literally what happened. The municipality rang us up, and they said, would we like to have an advertising school named the WPP Advertising School, on the condition that we provided the curriculum and we provided the teaching. They would provide us with the building, and SADA is a design school about half an hour outside the center of Shanghai, so it's really part of Shanghai conurbation. It's got 10,000 students, and we started from scratch 2-3 years ago. We now have probably around 200 students doing a 4-year course. We get first dibs on the students. They do sandwich courses. We pick the best ones, and we absorb them into our 16,000 strong operation in China. That would not happen here. I can't imagine a borough council or Boris ringing me up and say, Martin, would you like a WPP advertising school? Here's a building in Chinatown. Here's a building. You provide the curriculum. and the teaching. Now, interesting about the teaching is we have high churn in China. Our churn rate is about a third, which, by the way, is better than Goldman Sachs and McKinsey last time we checked. But it means we turn over a third. And the reason that we turn over such a high number is the market is growing so rapidly, and the supply of people is so limited, the demand is great, and obviously that pushes, and people move if they get better offers. But qualitatively, one of the big attractions that we can offer people is the opportunity to teach young people and develop the curriculum for university.
I've hogged enough questions, although I still have 2 or 3 needling one, which I will reserve until the last question.
Oh, boy.
So I'd like to open it up to the floor. Now, who's got an intelligent question? Yes, the first one up here. Have you got a microphone? Yes. And then Carol Thatcher, the second.
Can you say who you are and where you're from, sir?
Sure. I'm not sure it's intelligent. So
Carol Thatcher is that woman over there.
So my name is Enrique Garcia Yesta from a company called InDigital, which is in the digital mobile space. Yeah. And I guess maybe 2 points. One of them to
just
justify.
Just 1 point. Just ask the question.
Sure. Okay. So you've given a snapshot of the current moment of China versus the rest of the world. I guess maybe the interest and maybe to justify the 16,000 is what is the growth rates that you are seeing, because maybe that would give a lot of the logic to.
Yeah. Well, we had our growth rate has been twice the GDP growth rate. In what I call fast growth markets, you must never call these countries developing markets. China's already I should make it quite clear. China's although it's our 3rd largest market, it's the 2nd largest advertising market in the world. It overtook Japan a year, 2, 3 years ago. Second only to the United States. It will be the biggest advertising market. It'll take a few years, but it will be. Our growth rate, so it's insulting to call it a developing market, it's developed. Our growth rate has tended to be in these faster growth markets twice GDP rate. That has slowed as obviously as GDP has slowed. Now the official GDP growth rate is 7%. That's what the government says it is. Cooling from 7.5. Now, because we give our eye teeth, here is the UK growing at under 3, and it's the fastest growing of the G7. We give our eye teeth for 7. And by the way, this is, so just get the numbers right. You know, China is a $16 trillion a $10 trillion economy. The EU is 16, the US is roughly 16. So China's 10, and we in the UK are about 3. Germany's about 3.5. So orders of magnitude, just to understand. The growth, so a China that grows at 7, if it really is 7, David no doubt will nudge me and say, is it really 7? Even if it was growing at 5 or 4 or 3, a country that's 3 times the size of the UK, growing even at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, obviously makes a bigger contribution than a much smaller country as China was 10 years ago, growing at 10. But by and large, we grow at still grow at significantly greater than the GDP growth rate, because advertising and marketing is a lower proportion of GDP than it is in the more mature markets. So there's still room for China to grow as a proportion. Now, there's a couple of other things that are really important. If you look at the 12th five-year plan, what did the 12th five-year plan, which is coming to a close, that talked about a GDP growth rate of 7.5%. The 11th plan talked about a GDP growth rate of 7.5 too, but they did 11, I think it was, in that plan. But the 12th plan had a number of fundamental tenets. The first one was, for China to grow, you had to switch from savings to consumption. Secondly, and so it was to stimulate consumption. Secondly, why did people save? People saved because the healthcare system was not as developed as it should be, and people saved for their parents' old age and their own old age. And the third piece of it was the development of service businesses. And I remember when I went to the China Development Forum several years ago, at the time the 11th five-year plan was being put in place, I was sitting next to somebody when we were with the Premier at that time who laid out the 12th five-year plan, and he nudged me and said, that sounds like a sort of charter, a manifesto for WPP in China. And it was. So consumption, healthcare safety net. We have big healthcare operations as well. And last but not least, the growth of the service companies. And one other little final thing that was really interesting. At the last China Development Forum a few weeks ago, we were being briefed by the Premier. We had a 2-hour session with the Premier where he took questions from everybody, including people like Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. In fact, he took 2 questions from Martin Wolf. And what was really interesting was his emphasis on entrepreneurialism and investment. And the CEO sitting next to me nudged me and said, that sounded exactly like Mrs. Thatcher. Quite interesting. And he also emphasized the importance of service businesses. Now, why is it that the Chinese are so keen on service businesses? And in fact, there was one chart at the CDF that was really interesting, which showed that services as a proportion of Chinese GDP last year, for the first time in 2014, outdistanced manufacturing's contribution. Why are they doing that? The reason is that to deal with social unrest, which is a big issue, absorbing the millions of people that come in from the rural areas of China into the urban conurbations, absorbing those people, service businesses are much more effective in absorbing that labor pool than manufacturing businesses, particularly when a higher wage economy, coming back to the question about productivity, when China is becoming a greater higher wage economy. So net, we grow, and currently, first quarter of this year, we did very well. Last year, we did very well. You look at our published numbers. This quarter has been a little bit more difficult. But just finally, and it's a really important point, worldwide GDP this year, worldwide advertising growth this year, there will be 2 major contributors to it, a G2, the US and China. And we should be careful what we wish for. Because if China doesn't grow, it's bad for all of us. Because those are the 2 engines of worldwide GDP growth.
Well, you sure you're finished?
Yeah. Sorry.
So I assume that probably China will be then like the UK in the, 5 years' time or so? Will be the size of your business in China will be about like the UK in 5 years' time or so?
China will have to double its size to reach where the UK is now. Right? We're at 3.2 billion. That's going to take some time. But will it happen? It will happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Closer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the answer to the second question is definitely yes. I mean, I believe everybody should vote. I think actually the Brazilian system, I think I'm right in saying, is that if you don't vote, you get fined. Unfortunately, it's not a lot of money that you get fined, but I think, having fought so hard to earn the right to vote, men and women, we should all vote. Now, we don't have to vote for a particular, we can say, don't know, or I'm not going to vote for a candidate, but I think everybody should go to the booth or go online and vote. I think that's an obligation of any citizen. And unfortunately, what was the turnout last week? 70? 67. Okay, so not good enough, right? Can you imagine what would have happened if everybody had to go through the mental process of making that decision one way or another? On the first point, and it's interesting, Labour was meant to be better organized, from what I had heard. It's apocryphal stuff. It's anecdotal. But what I had heard, that they were much better organized. Now, interestingly, both parties, both the Labour and the Conservative Party, had advisors from Obama. Labour had David Axelrod. They had the support of Blue State Digital, which was, well, not Blue State Digital agency, but individuals who had, it's one of our agencies, who had worked on 2 of Obama's campaigns, both campaigns which have been successful. And what they did, by the way, on the Obama campaign was raise, in the first campaign, it was $1 billion on small contributions online. So instead of going to the unions for big contributions or to the PACs, the political action committees, and the Koch brothers in America for big donations to the PACs, what they did is they went online and got small contributions from myriad of people. Interestingly, I think in the second campaign, the Blue State raised about 700 to 800 million, which shows you a little bit about what had happened between the first and second Obama administrations, but it was still the same. But the basic idea was using social media. So Labour had Axelrod, the Conservatives had Messina, who was also one of Obama's people. So both, ironically, both were using those techniques. I don't know the detail. I don't know what Linton Crosby did a brilliant job. You've got to admire, despite what the polls said, the final result, as we all know, was something that nobody that I'm aware of predicted, i.e. a conservative majority. Some might have predicted a conservative-dominated coalition, but very few, if any, talked about a conservative majority. But the power of social media, so just think about it. In China, almost a third, 30 billion out of 80, so it's more than a third, is internet influenced. So, and the thing about China is they've leapfrogged the PC. So they went from 0 to mobile, whereas we've gone 0, PC, mobile. And the internet, mobile penetration, last time I checked, was about 1.2, 1.3 billion. China Mobile itself had about 950 to 1 billion network subscribers. So you're talking about sort of almost 100% saturation already. You have more than 100% because some people have more than one mobile device. But it's extremely powerful. So I think, Carol, definitely we should have online voting. It's ridiculous that we still use these boxes with pieces of paper.
Who are you first? You look like very distinguished.
You would be foolish to underestimate Hong Kong. It's a very interesting question because I can remember 10 years ago, maybe even longer actually, 15 years ago, being encouraged to shift the core of our operations, subtly, not brutally, but subtly encouraged to shift the core of our operations from Hong Kong, which is where they were, to Beijing and Shanghai. So I wouldn't, but it's interesting thing is that our operations in Hong Kong are under pressure, whereas mainland China continues to grow strongly. And Taiwan, after a bumpy ride, now has reassumed growth. I would say that Hong Kong is the most pressurized. We talk about Greater China in our results. We distinguish between Greater China and mainland China, and Greater China includes Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I wouldn't discount it. I wouldn't say, it's doomed. I wouldn't say it's handicapped, but the balance has shifted. And, we spend far more of our time, to be frank, in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen and Chengdu and Chongqing and the other 80 cities or so that you have to remember, last time I checked, there are 184 cities in China with more than 1 million people. And you have to, we live in some argue a crowded aisle, some say an overcrowded aisle of 60, what are we up to, 63 or 66?
Ask her, how many people?
63 or 66.
Same number as the percentage of turnout.
And it's we're looking at 1.2, 1.3 billion.
Well, there are in fact cities with over 30 billion, Chongqing.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing. You don't realize the scale.
There are quite a lot of us. Okay, thank God there's a lady, a female question.
Thank you very much. Two questions. The first
No,
question.
one question, tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Grace. I do Chinese business and social network. Two questions. The first question is related to Hong Kong. Because we know for a very long time, Hong Kong has been a very competitive cities in Asia. But in the past 1 or 2 years, Hong Kong has been have been suffered so much as for some political or other reason, we know. So, and from WPP's perspective, would you say what Hong Kong should do to maintain its competitiveness in Asia as as a world city in Asia? The second question is about we know China, because many people they say if they don't know China, they say China is one market. But if you enter into China, you would say China is. They have so many different markets. So in WPP, and how do you segmenting your operating in China? Thank you.
So Martin will answer the second part of that question as your one question.
Okay.
Because we got
Okay,
less than 10 minutes. We need
I mean,
one
you're
more.
right. China is really 32 different provinces, and in one way or another. And therefore, you have to segment it very differently. And you look, China is not the coastal plain. People get confused because they think it's all Beijing and Shanghai, and the sophistication that you see particularly in Shanghai. I mean, Shanghai to me is the new New York. I remember sitting in the Pudong, you now have 3 big towers I don't think the 3rd tower is open yet, but shortly will be. You have 3 big towers, and I was sitting in the Grand Hyatt, I think it was, one Sunday morning, and looking at all the parties going on, and weddings and everything. I was thinking, where was I? This is what
Shanghai.
New Yorkers would like New York to be, right? It's really a new New York, phenomenal. So, but that's very different. That is not the Midwest. Using
But is it the same as the US, which, of course, for us non-Americans, also view America as mainly through the prism of Hollywood on the West Coast?
Well, you
and,
do.
New York. No, I know.
But
I know there's some very
East and West Coast.
God-loving...
Yeah, no, East and West
right.
Coast. So I was in Las Vegas a week or so ago, and I remember it was a head of one of the networks said to me, if we want to have a focus group on America, we have focus groups in Las Vegas, because that's where you get a true cross-section of America. And it's if you look at the people in Las Vegas, you see a very varied bunch. So you're right, Dave. I mean, is it the same as America? No. It's different in terms of the characteristics, but is it the same in terms of diversity? Yes. And
it's not one country.
it is
it's
not one
regions.
country. It is it's just like India. India is not one country. It's Russia. Russia is 7 time zones, 9 time zones. It's ludicrous. I mean, corporate organizations, it is ludicrous. Now, you can even quote me on that. It's ludicrous to say you would treat Brazil, Russia, India, and China, or Indonesia with 250 million people as you would Portugal, Greece, or Ireland. I mean, it doesn't make, or Singapore, doesn't make any sense. The other thing on Hong Kong is, I think of it as being one of the Chinese cities. And I think that's the route to Hong Kong's competitiveness. It may not be something that the Hong Kong Chinese are totally comfortable with, but I think that's the context in which you've got to see it. But you're right about the variety. And the mistake that Westerners make is believing that it's all that you see in a Shanghai or a Beijing.
Absolutely ludicrous. Right.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks. My name's Aaron Jessup, and I'm an architect. I'd just like to ask you something more conceptually about advertising. Now, in your experience, are you witnessing a change in how advertising and media is making a transition between west to east, and then now with a mature market in China, are you witnessing this advertising and media moving from east over to the west with the export of services from China globally?
Well, I think a mistake, I don't think there is, it's easy to develop concepts of the nature you're talking about. But I think there are some mistakes that Western companies make when they market in China, and I think that highlights the differences. So what you have in China, because it's a less mature, more, it has greater room to grow. What you're witnessing is consumers have awareness of brands. They have awareness of Chinese brands, but they don't have loyalty. The quality and sophistication of those brands has not got to a degree where Chinese companies have been able to build a relationship with consumers where consumers would have great loyalty. You know, we have pyramids. The top of the pyramid is loyalty. This is where we measure loyalty, and the bottom of the pyramid is awareness. You get tremendous awareness in China of brands because there is tremendous distribution. Right? You mentioned, I mentioned there's 100,000 part-time employees that we have as distributors and display people inside stores. They are making Chinese consumers aware of Chinese detergents, shampoos, toothpaste, whatever it happens to be. And the price points of Chinese products and services is lower. The Western companies come in at higher price points, often bringing in products which were suitable to Western markets, but coming back to the diversity question that was just previously asked, were not sophisticated enough, ironically, for the Chinese consumer. So what you have is you have great loyalty to Chinese brands, because the Chinese love Chinese brands. They travel prodigiously. We're just at the beginning of seeing Chinese growth and development in tourism. At Paris, I think the largest number of tourists in Paris are now Chinese. I think probably is maybe even true here.
Last week, 6,700 employees of one company were sent off on a holiday by the boss in Paris. 6,700 people. They swamped the Eiffel Tower. I wouldn't go there anymore. It would probably collapse.
But anyway,
you take all your employees of 285,000 on holiday.
180,000. We'll
180,000
all
to
to
China.
Shanghai, all to Hong Kong. But they come in at high price points. They have loyalty, but they don't have great awareness. So what the multinationals have to do is to lower their price points, tailor their products to the Chinese market, get greater awareness and greater distribution. The Chinese, so you have so what you have is the multinationals coming down the price curve, and the Chinese companies moving up the price curve. So I'm not sure there's a conceptual issue, but there is a very different approach. One of our people, Tom Doctoroff, who runs J. Walter Thompson Company in Asia, wrote a book several years ago, actually, on this theme called Billions. There have been billions of books written about China called Billions. His was another one called Billions. And he actually covered it very, very well, actually. So.
Which was the, historically for WPP, the most successful, single most successful advertising campaign in China?
The most successful.
Just blew your mind.
No,
Suddenly the
no,
sales
no,
went up.
No, well, we've done, no, it's very, it's bad publicly for me to say, but, you know, we've done work for Mongolian Cow.
Mongolian Cow.
Yili, the dairy company.
Outer or inner?
What?
Outer or inner?
Both.
Mongolia.
Both.
Oh, right. Because one is Russian, one is Chinese.
We've done
inner,
we've done
presumably.
work for Suning, the biggest retailer there, for Haier, Lenovo, CFC.
You're saying Lenovo, which is the largest PC manufacturer in the world, but yet you said that China went from, you know, fixed line to mobile and leapfrogged over the PC. So how do you explain that PC is still very much the core business of Lenovo, which reaches...
Well, if you look at, for example, the search product, whilst it's true to say mobile search is the fastest growth area, so Google is now our biggest relationship. Out of the 75 billion of media we buy, 3 billion comes from Google. It's not all search, but the Google search that we buy is desktop search and mobile. But what Lenovo did was to buy, we do the IBM work. Yeah. They bought the ThinkPad division of IBM, and they're running it, or attempting to run it, better than the Westerners did. And
are they succeeding?
Yes, I think they are, actually. I think they're doing better. I mean, this is a big, big challenge for Chinese companies. Can Chinese companies build multinational companies in the same way as other nations have done. My view is very simply this, and this is the heart of it. If you think that an island of 63 or 66 million people, whatever it is, can do better. I mean, if I believed that the Chinese couldn't develop better advertising agencies than we can, you know, I would be arrogant and at least ill-advised. Right? It is, the odds are, even if the Chinese are averagely intelligent, and I believe they are more than averagely intelligent, the odds are that 1.2 to 1.3 billion people are going to be able to do it better than us. And I just remind you that in the early 19th century, China and India contributed more than 40% of worldwide GDP. In fact, let me just tell you one very interesting story. So I was a trustee of the British Museum, and one of the things that the curator did was to get CEOs to come in and pick 3 artifacts from the British Museum one evening, pick 3 artifacts which exemplified their industry. And one of the things I picked was a piece of Meissen china from the early 19th century. And in 1819, or whenever it was, Meissen china and Wedgwood china were producing porcelain of the same quality as the Chinese porcelain industry, but undercut them on prices. And that was emblematic of what was going on. At that time, China and India, and indeed what we call the BRICS and Next 11, what Goldman called the BRICS and Next 11, which are the fast growth markets, were dominant, and they were 40 to 50% of worldwide GDP. They slumped down over 200 years, and I agree with the Chinese who say that the last 200 years have been a blip in history.
Well, but there is hope, because just as Argentina was the largest, was the wealthiest country in the world, so perhaps they might yet have a chance. Can I take one last question from the, yes, all right, well, quickly, both of you, very quickly. We've got 3 minutes.
2 last questions.
Yeah, 2 last questions.
Hi, my name's Susie Forbes. I set up the Condé Nast College of Fashion and Design here in London. We're about to open in Shanghai. I just wanted to, since there's been talk from Carol about the apathy and disengagement around our election, I just wondered if you could touch quickly on, I don't know how close you are to your advertising college, but what do you find the caliber and approach of the student body to be in China versus what you encounter here?
Superb. Superb.
And would you imagine...
So we would help you, and we'll help you with your fashion
Would you
design.
imagine bringing some of your, and obviously you've got a huge growing industry in China to supply talent into, but would you imagine those students coming to the UK?
Well, I think in the same way as our Indian, you know, we have we're about half the market in India. So we've had a long history. And we export talent from India around the world. And the people are superb. I mean, advertising for whatever, David Ogilvy, for example, was chairman of Ogilvy India almost until his dying day. Never flew, but used to take the boat for the AGMs or whatever. His books were translated into all forms of Indian dialects. It's the same, and it will happen. But frankly, you know, it's like Chinese companies should exhaust the opportunities in China first before they start running around the world, my view. Because the domestic opportunities, just think of the scale. You know, if I was starting an advertising agency and I had 1.2, 1.3 billion consumers, as opposed to 30 years ago when we started with, at that time, UK was 50 million, or 53, or whatever it was, the scale is just, the opportunity is phenomenal. So the quality is superb. And by the way, we're talking about a tech college. This is a tech college we're trying to get full university status in, we will do in China eventually. But it's not Tsinghua. You know, it's not Peking University. I mean, this is a tech college. And
Don't
it's
worry,
really
he will take all the good ones first, as he already confessed. Last question, very last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Patron. I'm a lawyer from Gibraltar with marketing experience in China. And I just wanted to have your take on the Made in China brand and the implications of that and the general perception that I saw both in China and in the West, especially in the premium luxury sector.
Well, again, with all due respect, I think it would be arrogant to believe, and there are some Chinese brands. There's some Chinese fashion brands.
Lots.
And they will be, I think, phenomenally successful. It is only a question of time. You know, and I just go back to what I said. You know, we used to say the same thing about Hong Kong. We used to say the same thing about Korea, the same thing about, my father was in the radio and electrical business, and I remember people used to, this would be in the 50s and the 60s, long time ago, and people would criticize and say poor quality and low grade. It's only a question of time. Now, I go regularly to the car shows, and I remember people used to say the same thing about Kia and Hyundai. You know, I was told, don't bother to go on, you know, the Detroit Motor Show. Don't bother to go on the Hyundai. The cars are useless, you know, let's say 5, 10 years ago. Every year, incremental. And the gift the Chinese have is they listen and they learn, which is an art that we've sort of lost. So I think, watch out. That would be my, I'm just not applying it to technology. They really do. They adapt really rapidly. They listen, they learn, and if they make a mistake, they learn from it.
Can I just ask one very last question, exercising my prerogative? Have you ever been pressurized by Chinese authorities to exercise censorship over your advertising campaigns?
Not to my knowledge. I was going to do a firm no. Now, that doesn't mean that in getting to the creative solution that people have not filtered out solutions because they knew they would be unacceptable. But so knowing the standards in inverted commas that are imposed. And of course, you know, censorship has become heavier, particularly in online media in China under the new regime.
Well, there lies the secret of WPP and Sir Martin Sorrell for being a very good boy in China. And may I, on behalf of all of you and myself and China Exchange, thank Sir Martin for a most copious, comprehensive, far-ranging, stimulating, exciting, revealing expose of both the successes he has made of this company, which, in fact, I have to confess, does exercise a great deal of influence in China, because being the largest advertising agency there must measure a great deal. And I hope that WPP will go from strength to strength as a public company, so all of you can buy shares in it.
You're not allowed to say that, David.
Well, there it is. Can we give a round of applause for Sir Martin?
Thank you.
You sign that.
Yes, of course I will.
It's perfectly legitimate for me to promote their shares. I'm not a shareholder yet, but I will this afternoon. And thank you very much for coming. This afternoon we've got Eric Schmidt, and later on in the afternoon we've got Carlos Acosta, and you will see on the way out that there's a leaflet of further very stimulating participants, all of whom I hope that you will come and listen. But thank you again, Sir Martin.
Thank you, David.